Part 3. The dawn of the next day found Jean Valjean near the bed of Cosette. He waited there, motionless, to see her wake. Something new was entering his soul. Jean Valjean had never loved anything. For 25 years he had been alone in the world. He had never been a father, lover, husband, or friend. At the galleys he was cross, sullen, abstinent, ignorant, and intractable. The heart of the old convict was full of freshness. His sister and her children had left in his memory only a vague and distinct impression, which had finally almost entirely vanished. He had made every exertion to find them again, and, not succeeding, had forgotten them. Human nature is thus constituted. The other tender emotions of his youth, if any such he had, were lost in an abyss. When he saw Cosette, when he had taken her, carried her away, and rescued her, he felt his heart moved. All that he had of feeling and affection was aroused and vehemently attracted towards this child. He would approach the bed where she slept, and would tremble there with delight. He felt inward yearnings like a mother, and knew not what they were, for it is something very incomprehensible, and very sweet, this grand and strange emotion of a heart in its first love. Poor old heart, so young! But, as he was 55, and Cosette was but 8 years old, all that he might have felt of love in his entire life melted into a sort of ineffable radiance. This was the second white vision he had seen. The bishop had caused the dawn of virtue on his horizon. Cosette evoked the dawn of love. The first few days rolled by amid this bewilderment. On her part, Cosette, too, unconsciously went a change, poor little creature. She was so small when her mother left her that she could not recollect her now. As all children do, like the young shoots of the vine that cling to everything, she had tried to love. She had not been able to succeed. Everybody had repelled her. The Thénardiers, their children, other children. She had loved the dog. It died. And after that no person and no thing would have anything to do with her. Mournful thing to tell, at the age of 8 her heart was cold. This was not her fault. It was not the faculty of love that she lacked. Alas, it was the possibility. And so, from the very first day, all that thought and felt in her began to love this kind old friend. She now felt sensations entirely unknown to her before, a sensation of budding and of growth. Her kind friend no longer impressed her as old and poor. In her eyes, Jean Valjean was handsome, just like the garret had seemed pretty. Nature had placed a wide chasm, 50 years interval of age, between Jean Valjean and Cosette. This chasm fate filled up. Fate abruptly brought together, and wedded with its resistless power, these two shattered lives, dissimilar in years but similar in sorrow. The one, indeed, was a complement of the other. The instinct of Cosette sought for a father, as the instinct of Jean Valjean sought for a child. To meet was to find one another. In that mysterious moment when their hands touched, they were welded together. When their two souls saw each other, they recognized that they were mutually needed, and they closely embraced. Taking the words in their most comprehensive and most absolute sense, it might be said that, separated from everything by the walls of the tomb, Jean Valjean was the husband bereaved, as Cosette was the orphan. This position made Jean Valjean, in celestial sense, the father of Cosette. And, in truth, the mysterious impression produced upon Cosette, in the depths of the woods at Chelles by the hand of Jean Valjean grasping her own in the darkness, was not an illusion but a reality. The coming of this man and his participation in the destiny of this child had been the advent of God. In the meanwhile, Jean Valjean had chosen well his hiding place. He was there in a state of security that seemed to be complete. The apartment with the side chamber which he occupied with Cosette was the one whose window looked out upon the boulevard. This window being the only one in the house, there was no neighbor's prying eye to fear either from that side or opposite. The lower floor of number 5052 was a sort of dilapidated shed. It served as a sort of stable for market gardeners, and had no communication with the upper floor. The upper floor contained, as we have said, several rooms and a few lofts, only one of which was occupied by an old woman, who was maid of all work to Jean Valjean. All the rest was uninhabited. It was this old woman, honoured with the title of landlady, but in reality entrusted with the functions of portress, who had rented him these lodgings on Christmas Day. He had passed himself off to her as a gentleman of means, ruined by the Spanish bonds, who was going to live there with his granddaughter. He had paid her for 6 months in advance, and engaged the old dame to furnish the chamber and the little bedroom as we have described them. This old woman it was who had kindled the fire in the stove and made everything ready for them on the evening of their arrival. Weeks rolled by. These two beings led in that wretched shelter a happy life. From the earliest dawn, Cosette laughed, prattled, and sang. Children have their morning song, like birds. Sometimes it happened that Jean Valjean would take her little red hand, all chapped and frostbitten as it was, and kiss it. The poor child, accustomed only to blows, had no idea what this meant, and would draw back ashamed. At times, she grew serious, and looked musingly at her little black dress. Cosette was no longer in rags, she was in mourning. She was issuing from utter poverty, and was entering upon life. Jean Valjean had begun to teach her to read. Sometimes, when teaching the child to spell, he had remembered that it was with the intention of accomplishing evil that he had learned to read in the galleys. This intention had now been changed into teaching a child to read. Then the old convict would smile with the pensive smile of angels. He felt in this a preordination from on high, a volition of someone more than man, and he would lose himself in reverie. Good thoughts, as well as bad, have their abysses. To teach Cosette to read, and to watch her playing, was nearly all Jean Valjean's life. And then he would talk to her about her mother, and teach her to pray. She called him father, and knew him by no other name. This is but personal opinion, but in order to express our idea thoroughly, at the point Jean Valjean had reached, when he began to love Cosette, it is not clear to us that he did not require this fresh supply of goodness to enable him to persevere in the right path. He had seen the wickedness of men and the misery of society under new aspects, aspects incomplete and unfortunately showing forth only on one side of the truth. The lot of woman summed up in Fantine, public authority personified in Javert. He had been sent back to the galleys, this time for doing good. New waves of bitterness had overwhelmed him. Disgust and weariness had once more resumed their sway. The recollection of the bishop, even, was perhaps eclipsed, sure to reappear afterward, luminous and triumphant. Yet, in fact, this blessed remembrance was growing feebler. Who knows that Jean Valjean was not on the point of becoming discouraged and falling back to evil ways? Love came, and he again grew strong. Alas, he was no less feeble than Cosette. He protected her, and she gave strength to him. Thanks to him, she could walk upright in life. Thanks to her, he could persist in virtuous deeds. He was the support of this child, and this child was his prop and staff. O divine and unfathomable mystery of the compensations of destiny. Part 4. There was in the neighborhood of Saint-Médard a mendicant who sat crouching over the edge of a condemned public well nearby, and to whom Jean Valjean often gave alms. He never passed this man without giving him a few pennies. Sometimes he spoke to him. Those who were envious of this poor creature said he was in the pay of the police. He was an old church beadle of 75 who was always mumbling prayers. One evening, as Jean Valjean was passing that way, unaccompanied by Cosette, he noticed the beggar sitting in his usual place, under the street lamp, which had just been lighted. The man, according to custom, seemed to be praying and was bent over. Jean Valjean walked up to him and put a piece of money in his hand, as usual. The beggar suddenly raised his eyes, gazed intently at Jean Valjean, and then quickly dropped his head. The movement was like a flash. Jean Valjean shuddered. It seemed to him he had just seen, by the light of the street lamp, not the calm, sanctimonious face of the aged beadle, but a terrible and well-known countenance. He expressed the sensation one would feel on finding himself suddenly face to face in the gloom with a tiger. He recoiled, horror-stricken and petrified, daring neither to breathe nor to speak, to stay nor to fly, but gazing upon the beggar, who had once more bent down his head, with its tattered covering, and seemed to be no longer conscious of his presence. At this singular moment, an instinct, perhaps the mysterious instinct of self-preservation, prevented Jean Valjean from uttering a word. The beggar had the same form, the same rags, the same general appearance, as on any other day. "Huh!" said Jean Valjean to himself. "I am mad. I am dreaming. It cannot be." And he went home anxious and ill at ease. He scarcely dared to admit, even to himself, that the countenance he thought he had seen was the face of Javert. That night, upon reflection, he regretted that he had not questioned the man so as to compel him to raise his head a second time. On the morrow, at nightfall, he went thither again. The beggar was in his place. Good day, said Jean Valjean with firmness, as he gave him his accustomed arms. The beggar raised his head, and answered in a whining voice, Thanks, kind sir, thanks. It was indeed only the old beadle. Jean Valjean now felt fully reassured. He even began to laugh. What the deuce was I to fancy that I saw Javert? Thought he. Is my sight growing poor already? And he thought no more about it. Some days after, it might be 8 o'clock in the evening, he was in his room, giving Cosette her spelling lesson, which the child was repeating in a loud voice, when he heard the door of the building open and close again. That seemed odd to him. The old woman, the only occupant of the house besides him and Cosette, always went to bed at dark to save candles. Jean Valjean made a sign to Cosette to be silent. He heard someone coming up the stairs. Possibly it might be the old woman, who had felt unwell and had been to the druggist's. Jean Valjean listened. The footstep was heavy and sounded like a man's, but the old woman wore heavy shoes, and there was nothing so much like the step of a man as the step of an old woman. However, Jean Valjean blew out his candle. He sent Cosette to bed, telling her in a suppressed voice to lie down very quietly, and, as he kissed her forehead, the footsteps stopped. Jean Valjean remained silent and motionless, his back turned toward the door, still seated on his chair, from which he had not moved, and holding his breath in the darkness. After a considerable interval, not hearing anything more, he turned round without making any noise, and as he raised his eyes toward the door of his room, he saw a light through the keyhole. This ray of light was an evil star in the black background of the door and the wall. There was evidently somebody outside with a candle who was listening. A few minutes elapsed, and the light disappeared, but he heard no sound of footsteps, which seemed to indicate that whoever was listening at the door had taken off his shoes. Jean Valjean threw himself in his bed without undressing, but could not shut his eyes that night. At daybreak, he was sinking into slumber from fatigue. He was aroused again by the creaking of the door of some room at the end of the hall. Then he heard the same footstep which had ascended the stairs on the preceding night. The step approached. He darted from his bed and placed his eye to the keyhole, which was quite a large one, hoping to get a glimpse of the person, whoever it might be, who had made his way into the building in the night time, and had listened at his door. It was a man, indeed, who passed by Jean Valjean's room, this time without stopping. The hall was still too dark for him to make out his features, but when the man reached the stairs, a ray of light from without made his figure stand out like a profile. Jean Valjean had a full view of his back. The man was tall, wore a long frock coat, and had a cudgel under his arm. It was the redoubtable form of Javert. Jean Valjean might have tried to get another look at him through his window that opened on the boulevard, but he would have to raise the sash, and that he dared not do. It was evident that the man entered by means of a key, as if at home. Who, then, had given him the key, and what was the meaning of this? At 7 in the morning, he made a roll of 100 francs he had in the drawer, and put it into his pocket. Do what he would to manage this so that the clinking of the silver should not be heard, a 5 franc piece escaped his grasp and rolled jingling away over the floor. At dusk, he went to the street door and looked carefully up and down the boulevard. No one was to be seen. The boulevard seemed to be utterly deserted. It is true, there might have been someone hidden behind a tree. He went upstairs again. Come, he said to Cosette. He took her by the hand, and they both went out.